Ask most people what they know about Bangladesh, and you will get the same 3 words back almost every time: flooding, poverty, overcrowded. That is the file the world has kept on this country for decades, a footnote of disaster filed somewhere between too much water and too many people. None of it is exactly false. All of it is missing the point. Because on the same rivers the news calls a catastrophe every monsoon season, Bangladeshi farmers pull some of the most productive harvests per acre on the planet out of soil that flooding just fertilized for free. In the same industry the world still pictures as a sweatshop, this country now runs more environmentally certified green factories than any other nation on Earth, more than Germany, more than the United States. And on a stretch of delta smaller than the American state of Iowa, squeezed between 2 much larger neighbors, more human beings wake up every morning than in the entire country of Russia, a nation nearly 100 times its size. This is Bangladesh. It is a country the world has decided it already understands, whose poverty was manufactured by an empire that once treated it as one of the wealthiest provinces on the planet, and whose national anthem was written decades before the nation itself existed. Almost everything about that understanding is wrong, or at best, decades out of date. If you're into documentaries that dig up the parts of a country's story most people never hear, subscribe for more and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from. Start with the land itself, because even that gets misunderstood. Bangladesh sits at the base of 2 of the largest rivers on the planet, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, both of which spend their entire lives crossing the Himalayas and half of South Asia only to die here, spilling into the Bay of Bengal through the largest river delta on Earth. Add a 3rd river, the Meghna, and you have 3 enormous drainage systems, pulling water off a combined catchment area that spans 5 countries, all of it funneling down into one flat, waterlogged triangle of land, not much bigger than the American state of Iowa. More than 700 rivers and tributaries lace through that triangle. Bangladesh is not land that happens to have water running through it. It is built inside the water. Almost none of the country rises more than a few dozen meters above sea level, and every year, on schedule, between June and October, huge sections of it vanish under floodwater, the way a heartbeat repeats. Outsiders see that footage and assume disaster. Bangladeshi farmers, mostly, see a delivery. Each flood carries down millions of tons of silt scraped off the Himalayas on its way to the sea. And that silt is why this delta is some of the most fertile farmland on the planet, why rice can be grown here 3 times in a single year, why a country with less farmable land per person than almost anywhere else on Earth still manages to feed nearly all of itself. The flooding that makes the evening news in London or New York is the same flooding a Bangladeshi farmer has budgeted for since childhood. It isn't a flaw in this landscape. It's the machinery that keeps it alive. Picture standing in a rice paddy in July, water up to your shins, green shoots breaking the surface in perfect rows, the horizon a flat sheet of silver all the way to the sky. That image is disaster footage to a news producer in another hemisphere. To the farmer standing in it, it is simply Tuesday, and it's the reason there will be food on the table in November. That same exposed position on the map, wide open to the Bay of Bengal, has also made this coastline home to the deadliest tropical storm ever recorded anywhere on the planet. We'll come back to that storm later, because what Bangladesh eventually built in response to it might be more remarkable than the disaster itself. Zoom out, and the population numbers are almost hard to believe. Bangladesh is home to roughly 175 million people, the 8th most populated country on Earth, all packed into that same Iowa-sized stretch of delta. Do the math, and the population density comes out among the highest of any sizable nation in the world. And yet, more people live inside Bangladesh's borders today than live inside the entire country of Russia, a nation that spans 11 time zones and is close to 100 times larger by land area. Bangladesh could fit inside Russia more than 100 times over. Russia could not fit its own population inside itself as tightly as Bangladesh already has. Say the word Bangladesh out loud, though, and overcrowded usually arrives with an unspoken assumption riding along with it, that this many people crammed into this little land must mean chaos. It mostly doesn't, or at least not the way outsiders picture it. Walk into almost any neighborhood in the country and you will find something closer to the opposite of chaos, a level of everyday social cohesion that far less crowded nations would envy. Roughly 98% of the population shares one ethnicity, one mother tongue, Bengali, and a set of customs woven through nearly every household. The density here is real. The disorder most outsiders assume comes bundled with it is mostly a guess, dressed up as an observation. That 98% figure hides real diversity too. Roughly 1 in 10 Bangladeshis is Hindu, one of the largest Hindu populations of any Muslim-majority nation on Earth, and in the hills along the southeastern border with Myanmar and India, indigenous peoples such as the Chakma, Marma, and Tripura keep languages and traditions alive that predate Bengali settlement in the region entirely. The country most outsiders picture as religiously and ethnically uniform is, in its own quiet way, considerably more layered than that. There is also a second Bangladesh that exists almost entirely outside its own borders. Millions of Bangladeshi workers, mostly men, leave every year for construction sites and service jobs across the Gulf states, Malaysia, and beyond, sending home more than $30 billion in 2025 alone, one of the largest remittance flows on Earth relative to the size of the economy. Entire village economies run on money earned in Dubai or Riyadh and wired home every month, a quieter kind of migration story than the one usually told about this part of the world, and one that touches nearly every family in the country in some way. Dhaka, the capital, absorbs a huge share of that density, and its streets carry one of the country's most recognizable exports. The bell and rattle of the cycle rickshaw, hand-painted in colors loud enough to qualify as their own art form. So distinct, in fact, that UNESCO added Dhaka's rickshaws and their painting to its list of humanity's intangible cultural heritage in 2023. Dhaka is sometimes called the rickshaw capital of the world, and the title is not an exaggeration. Hundreds of thousands of these three-wheeled, human-powered machines move through the city every day, each one a rolling gallery of flowers, film stars, mosques, and tigers, painted by street artists, most of whom will never sign their names to the work. To understand how this crowded, waterlogged strip of delta ended up this culturally unified, you have to go back much further than the country's modern borders, because this land has been wealthy before. Under the Mughal Empire, Bengal was not a poor backwater. It was arguably the richest province in the empire, a manufacturing powerhouse exporting textiles across the known world. Its prize export was Dhaka muslin, a cotton so fine that a full 6-yard sari could be pulled through a finger ring, so fine that European traders nicknamed it woven air and evening dew. At its height, this single province is estimated to have generated a share of world manufacturing output that rivaled entire nations of Europe. Then came 1757 and the Battle of Plassey, where the British East India Company defeated the ruling Nawab of Bengal through a mix of battlefield force and battlefield bribery and took control of the province. 2 centuries of colonial rule followed, and it systematically hollowed the region out. Wealth pulled from Bengal helped bankroll the Industrial Revolution back in Britain, while Bengal itself endured repeated famines, the worst in 1943, when as many as 3 million people starved to death in a catastrophe later research has tied directly to wartime shipping and export policy decisions made in London, not to any failure of the harvest. The province that once produced woven air was, by the time colonial rule ended, one of the poorest corners of the British Empire. That is the true origin of the poverty the world still associates with this country. It was not a given. It was manufactured, the same way the muslin once was. In 1947, the British Empire in South Asia was carved into two new countries along religious lines, a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. And here, geography turns almost absurd. Pakistan was not one country. It was two, separated by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, joined only by the idea that Muslims on both sides of the subcontinent should share a single flag. West Pakistan, where the government, the military, and the money were based, spoke Urdu and Punjabi. East Pakistan, formerly East Bengal, spoke Bengali and held the majority of the entire new country's population. The marriage lasted less than 25 years, and language, not religion, is what broke it first. In 1948, Pakistan's founding leadership declared that Urdu, spoken by a small minority of the population, would be the country's sole official language. Bengali, spoken by the majority in the East, would have no official status at all. To Bengali speakers in East Pakistan, this did not read as a bureaucratic footnote. It read as an attempt to erase them. Students in Dhaka organized protests, and on February 21, 1952, police opened fire on a demonstration at the University of Dhaka, killing several student protesters. The date is now marked in Bangladesh as Language Martyrs' Day, and what happened that afternoon eventually did something few street protests in history have ever managed. It rewrote the international calendar. In 1999, UNESCO proclaimed February 21st as International Mother Language Day, observed in schools and institutions across the planet every year since 2000. Almost nobody who marks that day outside Bangladesh realizes where it came from. A handful of students in Dhaka shot for demanding the right to speak their own language in their own country. That 1952 movement planted the idea that would eventually split Pakistan in two, that a nation is not defined only by the God its people pray to. It can be defined by the language they dream in. Nearly 2 decades of political and economic marginalization followed. East Pakistan generated as much as 70% of Pakistan's export earnings in some years and saw only a fraction of that investment return east. The resentment built steadily. In 1970, it collided with catastrophe. Cyclone Pola tore through the coast of East Pakistan and killed somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people in a single night, making it, to this day, the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded on Earth. The response from the government in West Pakistan was slow, and to many Bengalis watching their coastline bury its dead, close to indifferent. We will come back to what this country eventually built out of that specific tragedy. For now, what matters is the fury it added to an already fracturing union. In December of that year, East Pakistan voted overwhelmingly for the Awami League, a Bengali nationalist party led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, giving it a majority in Pakistan's National Assembly. West Pakistan's military government refused to hand over power. On the night of March 25, 1971, the Pakistani army launched a brutal crackdown on Dhaka, arresting Mujibur Rahman and opening fire on civilians, students, and academics across the city. It was the spark for the Bangladesh Liberation War. 9 months of guerrilla conflict and, by most historical accounts, mass atrocities against Bengali civilians, with death toll estimates that remain disputed to this day, ranging from the hundreds of thousands into the millions. Roughly 10 million refugees crossed into India during the fighting. In December 1971, Indian forces intervened directly on the side of the Bengali resistance, and on December 16th, Pakistani forces in the east surrendered. Bangladesh was born, and the country marks that date every year as Victory Day. The song that carried the movement through all of it was Amar Sonar Bangla, My Golden Bengal, written not by a politician but by a poet 6 decades earlier. Rabindranath Tagore, Asia's first Nobel laureate in literature, who composed it in 1905 as a protest against an earlier, British-imposed partition of Bengal. In 1972, newly independent Bangladesh adopted it as its national anthem. Tagore, it turns out, had already written India's national anthem too, and inspired a third in Sri Lanka, through a student who once studied under him. One poet, three flags, and an anthem for a country that did not exist yet when he wrote the words. That is how Bangladesh arrived on the map, built from a language its rulers tried to erase, a delta its colonizers tried to drain of wealth, and a poem written 7 decades before anyone knew it would need a country to sing it in. What this country did with all of that in the 55 years since is where the story gets even harder to believe, and it's exactly where we pick up next. In a windowless room in the White House Situation Room, in the first week of December 1971, with the Pakistani army losing its last battles in the East, a group of senior American officials sat down to discuss what would happen to the country that hadn't officially been born yet. Someone raised the coming famine. Someone else raised the fact that this new nation would need help with almost everything, because the war was leaving it almost nothing to start with. An international basket case, said you? Alexis Johnson, the Undersecretary of State, describing the country about to exist. Henry Kissinger, chairing the meeting, didn't correct him. He simply added a line of his own. But not necessarily our basket case. History flattened that exchange the way it flattens most things. For 50 years, popular memory has handed the entire quote to Kissinger alone, as though he coined the phrase rather than merely failed to object to it. Almost nobody outside a handful of historians ever bothered with the distinction. Bangladesh got stuck with the label either way, and for a while, the label wasn't unreasonable. 9 months of war had left something close to 10 million refugees to resettle and an economy with almost nothing left running. 3 years later, a famine driven by flooding, food hoarding, and a foreign grain embargo that arrived at the worst possible moment killed anywhere from the 27,000 people the government initially counted to the roughly 1.5 million that later economic reconstructions suggest, depending on whose numbers you trust. On paper, in 1974, Johnson's prediction looked generous. 55 years is a long time to prove a room full of diplomats wrong. Start with an industry the introduction to this series already gave away. In 1977, a former Bangladeshi civil servant and wartime freedom fighter named Norul Quadr decided his country needed to sell the world something more valuable than raw jute and opened a small garment factory in Chittagong called Desh Garments. He had no idea how to run a modern export operation, so he partnered with the South Korean conglomerate Daewoo and sent about 130 of his own workers to Daewoo's plant in Busan for 6 months of training in how to cut, sew, and ship a shirt to an international standard. It was meant to be a straightforward transfer of technology. Instead, within a year of coming home, more than 100 of those same 130 trained workers quit Desh Garments and opened their own competing factories using exactly what they had just learned. The knowledge kept spreading the same way after that, factory to factory, almost entirely by word of mouth. In less than a decade, one training program in South Korea had multiplied into hundreds of Bangladeshi garment factories. That accident of history is why, by the end of 2024, Bangladesh's garment exports alone were worth roughly $50 billion a year, and why the country now trails only China as the world's largest exporter of ready-made clothing, a sector that employs more than 4 million people, most of them women who, a generation earlier, would have had no realistic access to a factory wage at all. This is also why an earlier claim from this series holds up under scrutiny. Nowhere else on the planet are there more environmentally certified garment factories. More than 270 factories across Bangladesh now carry LEED certification from the U.S. Green Building Council, and more than half of the world's 100 highest-rated LEED-certified factories in any country are Bangladeshi. Step inside one of the platinum-rated units outside Dhaka, and you'll find rooftop solar panels, rainwater harvesting tanks, and rows of sewing machines running on servo motors that use half the power of a standard line. A long way from the image, the words Bangladeshi garment factory still summon for most people who have never set foot inside one. That image, unfortunately, wasn't always unearned. On the morning of April 24th, 2013, thousands of garment workers at a building called Rana Plaza on the outskirts of Dhaka were ordered back to their sewing machines a day after deep cracks in the structure had already forced everyone out once. 90 seconds after the building gave way, it was rubble. By the time rescue crews finished searching 19 days later, 1,134 people were confirmed dead and more than 2,500 injured, the deadliest disaster in the history of the global garment industry. The reaction to Rana Plaza did something international outrage rarely manages. It actually changed an industry. Within weeks, more than 200 global retailers who had quietly sourced from factories, just like the ones inside that building, signed a legally binding safety accord, funding independent inspections across thousands of Bangladeshi factories. The country's garment sector minimum wage nearly doubled. Hundreds of labor unions, essentially non-existent in the industry before the collapse, sprang up almost overnight. None of it undoes what happened, and parts of the industry are still finishing that remediation work more than a decade later. But the solar-paneled LEED platinum factories now scattered across the country exist, at least in part because of the horror at Rana Plaza, not in spite of it. In Bangladesh, progress rarely seems to arrive by the easy road. Clothing wasn't the only export this country built out of catastrophe. The 1974 famine that nearly proved the basket case line correct was also unfolding just a few miles from a young economics professor named Muhammad Yunus, who began to suspect that the theories he was teaching in his university classroom were useless to the starving people he could see out the window. He started lending small sums of his own money directly to poor villagers who had never qualified for a bank loan in their lives and needed no collateral to get one from him. In 1983, he turned the idea into an institution, Grameen Bank. By the time Yunus and Grameen jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006, the bank had issued loans to more than 7 million borrowers, over 95% of them women, and the model it pioneered, microcredit, had already been copied in more than 100 countries, including the United States. A country dismissed as a basket case in 1971, exporting a financial invention to the rest of the world by 2006 would have sounded like a joke to the men in that Washington meeting room. It gets stranger from here, because the same government that once celebrated Yunus as a national hero eventually pushed him out of the bank he built in 2011 and spent much of the following decade tying him up in legal disputes. Nobody in Bangladesh, least of all Yunus himself, could have guessed where that rivalry would eventually leave him. We'll come back to him one more time before this is over. Step back from any single industry and look at the country's broader vital signs, because development economists sometimes have a specific name for the pattern that shows up there: the Bangladesh paradox, a country consistently outperforming what its income level alone would predict. Life expectancy has climbed from about 46 years at independence to roughly 73 today. Bangladesh was among the first developing nations on Earth to close the gender gap in primary school enrollment, and its female literacy rate now runs higher than India's and considerably higher than Pakistan's, the two countries it was carved out of and alongside. Between 2010 and 2022 alone, tens of millions of Bangladeshis climbed out of poverty, with the share of the population living in extreme poverty falling into the mid-single digits at its lowest recorded point. None of it happened because the country grew rich first and could then afford better health and schooling, which is the order economic textbooks generally expect. It happened mostly in reverse, which is exactly why economists keep calling it a paradox instead of a formula. Now, finally, back to that storm from earlier in this series. In November 1970, Cyclone Pola killed somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people along this exact coastline in a single night, still the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded anywhere on Earth. The government's slow, indifferent response to that death toll is one of the sparks that lit the war for independence in the first place. In a real sense, Bangladesh exists partly because of how many of its people that one storm was allowed to kill. So the country built something to make sure it never happened again, and it might be the single most underrated disaster prevention program on the planet. The Cyclone Preparedness Program, run jointly by the government and the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society since the years just after Pola, now trains and deploys more than 76,000 volunteers, roughly half of them women, spread across more than 3,800 coastal villages. Picture one of them on the night a cyclone makes landfall. A volunteer on a bicycle, hand-cranked siren strapped to the rack, riding down a dark, unpaved road toward a village with no electricity and no television. Banging on doors because a warning picked up hours earlier now has to travel the last mile on foot and muscle. Multiply that volunteer by the tens of thousands, add more than 14,000 concrete cyclone shelters now standing along the coast, up from around 400 just 3 decades ago, and you have most of the explanation for what happened next. Cyclone Pola killed as many as 500,000 people in 1970. A cyclone of comparable strength in 1991 killed around 139,000. Horrifying, but already a fraction of the toll 2 decades earlier. By 2007, Cyclone Sidr, again a storm of similar force, killed around 4,000 people, more than a 100-fold drop in fatalities in under 40 years, even as the number of people living in the storm's direct path kept growing. In May 2024, Cyclone Remal made landfall on nearly the same stretch of coast. Pola had devastated 54 years earlier. More than 800,000 people were evacuated in Bangladesh in the days beforehand. The confirmed death toll in the country was under 20. Every one of those lives still mattered enormously to the families who lost them, and rising seas mean cyclones aren't going anywhere. But the country, the world once assumed, couldn't organize itself to survive its own coastline, has quietly built one of the most effective early warning and evacuation systems anywhere on Earth, cyclone or otherwise, largely on the backs of ordinary villagers on bicycles. The same instinct, turning the water into a tool instead of only treating it as an enemy, shows up on land, too. In the flood-prone wetlands of the South, farming families have spent an estimated 300 to 400 years weaving thick rafts out of water hyacinth, then growing vegetables directly on top of them, so that when the fields underneath disappear beneath the monsoon for months at a stretch, the harvest simply rises with the water instead of drowning in it. International agencies now study these floating gardens as a genuine model for climate adaptation, and the technique has already been exported to flood-prone farming communities in Vietnam, Myanmar, and as far away as South Sudan. A farming trick born of necessity in the Bengal Delta has quietly become one of Bangladesh's exports to the rest of the world, right alongside the sewing machine. None of this erases the harder chapters still being written. Bangladesh remains one of the most climate-exposed countries on the planet, and rising seas threaten a meaningful share of its low-lying land within the lifetime of people alive today. In the southeast, Cox's Bazar now holds the largest refugee settlement anywhere in the world. More than 1 million Rohingya Muslims who fled a campaign of violence in neighboring Myanmar since 2017, holding citizenship in no country and no fixed date to return to one. And the last few years have been rockier than the multi-decade trend line suggests. Inflation, a currency crisis, and the political upheaval still to come pushed the national poverty rate, measured more broadly than the extreme poverty figures above, from under 19% in 2022 to over 21% by 2025. A reminder that this country's progress has never moved in a straight line, and it isn't about to start now, because that upheaval is the final, unfinished chapter of this story, and it's still being written as this video is being made. In the summer of 2024, university students began protesting a quota system that reserved a majority of government jobs for specific groups, including descendants of 1971 war veterans. Within weeks, what began as a dispute over civil service hiring became the largest anti-government movement Bangladesh had seen in decades, as security forces killed an estimated 300 protesters trying to put it down. On August 5th, 2024, after weeks of escalating violence, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, daughter of the country's founding leader, re-signed and fled by helicopter to India, ending a final, unbroken stretch of 15 years in power. An interim government took over within days, led by a chief advisor the student movement had specifically asked for by name. Muhammad Yunus, the same Nobel laureate the Hasina government had pushed out of the bank he built just over a decade earlier. The banker who once lent his own pocket money to villagers no bank would touch was suddenly running the entire country. The 18 months since have not been simple. In November 2025, a war crimes tribunal convicted Hasina in absentia of crimes against humanity for the crackdown that killed those protesters and sentenced her to death. She remains in exile in India. Weeks later, her longtime rival, former Prime Minister Khaleda Zia, died after a long illness, clearing another major figure from a political landscape already being rebuilt from the ground up. In February 2026, Bangladesh held its first general election since Hasina's fall, alongside a national referendum on a package of constitutional reforms, with her Awami League barred from taking part. For the first time, the country's overseas workers, the same diaspora whose remittances quietly keep the wider economy afloat, were able to vote by postal ballot. Turnout ran close to 60%, among the highest in years, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Tariq-e-Rahman, a man who had spent 17 years in exile of his own, won by a landslide. What comes next for Bangladesh's politics is genuinely unwritten, and anyone who tells you they already know how it settles is guessing. But the detail worth sitting with is this. A Nobel Peace Prize-winning economist, once treated by his own government as a rival worth sidelining, ended up steering his country through the most consequential political transition in its 55-year history. That is not the kind of detail that survives a summary built out of 3 words, which is really the point of coming back for a second look. This is a country where flooding fertilizes some of the most productive farmland on the planet, where a 6-month sewing lesson from South Korea in 1979 grew into a $50 billion industry with more certified green factories than any other nation on Earth, where the deadliest cyclone ever recorded eventually produced one of the most effective disaster warning systems that exists anywhere, and where a professor who started out lending his own pocket change to villagers ended up, decades later, running the country that once tried to push him out of public life altogether. Under the Mughals, this land wove cotton so fine that Europeans called it woven air, and an empire took the profits and left poverty behind as its only lasting export. 55 years after the war that created this country, the poem a Bengali poet wrote to protest an earlier partition of Bengal is still sung as its national anthem. Its farmers still turn floodwater into 3 rice harvests a year, and its factories still weave the world's clothing, except this time, unevenly and imperfectly, more of the profit stays home. Bangladesh was never the basket case, a room of American officials predicted in 1971. It has spent 55 years arguing with the label the rest of the world handed it at birth, and so far, it's winning that argument. If this two-part look at Bangladesh left you with a different picture than the one you arrived with, that's the entire reason this channel exists. Subscribe if you want more of these, and tell us in the comments which country deserves the same kind of second look next.